From All Rivers Run to the Sea. Elie Wiesel. Our turn came on Tuesday, May 16. "All Jews out!" the gendarmes screamed, and we found ourselves in the street. There was another heat wave. My little sister was thirsty, and my grandmother, too. They didn't complain, but I did, not openly, but it amounted to the same thing. I felt queasy, ill. I was suffering, but didn't know from what. I was ineffably sad. As in the presence of death, I didn't dare raise my voice. This was where my childhood and my adolescence, my prayers, studies, and fasting had led. These moments would remain forever etched within me. Wherever life took me, a part of me would always remain in that street, in front of my empty house, awaiting the order to depart. I see my little sister. I see her with her rucksack, so cumbersome, so heavy. I see her, and an immense tenderness sweeps over me. Never will her innocent smile fade from my soul. Never will her glance cease to sear me. I tried to help her. She protested. Never will the sound of her voice leave my heart. She was thirsty. My little sister was thirsty. Her lips were parched. Pearls of sweat formed on her clear forehead. I gave her a little water. I can wait, she said, smiling. My little sister wanted to be brave, and I wanted to die in her place. I seldom speak of her in my writing, for I dare not. My little sister with her sun-bathed golden hair is my secret. I never even talked to Marion or to my son Elisha about her. It mortifies me to talk about her in the past tense, for she is present. Her presence is more real to me than my own. My little sister Sipporah, my little angel scorched by a darkened sun, I cannot picture you as death's hostage. You will remain on our street, on the pavement in front of our house. I gazed at the house, we all did, with anguish. Here we had lived a Jewish family life that was now gone forever. The laughter and laments, the peace of Shabbat. The prayer of the God of Abraham, whispered by my mother and my grandmother. The festival of Sukkot. The songs of Rosh Hashanah. The Passover meals, the community gatherings, my grandfather's visits. The stories of beggars and of refugees. The forbidden broadcasts of Radio London and Radio Moscow that we listened to at night, curtains drawn and shutters closed. I picture myself sitting under an acacia tree, a book in my hands, talking to the clouds. Sepuka is playing with a hoop. "Come and play with me," she says. But I don't feel like it. And now, as I write these words, my heart is pounding. I should have closed my book and stopped my dream. Dropped everything to play with my little sister. Other images rise up. The sleigh in winter, the horse and carriage in summer, a cousin's funeral. A fortune-teller is said to have foretold her death. B, sick with typhus. She lies in a room of her own, feverish and contagious, hovering between life and death. My grandmother asks me to go with her to the synagogue. It is night. She opens the Holy Ark and sobs. "Holy Torah, intercede on behalf of Batya, daughter of Sarah. She is young and can still accomplish many good deeds for your glory. Tell the Lord, blessed be his name, to let her live. She will be more useful to him than I." She closes the ark and backs slowly to the door. There she stops and says, "If I have any years to live, Lord, give them to her. I exchange my future for hers. Let that be my gift." When B takes a few steps, I glance at my grandmother. She has offered her life. What will become of her now? I picture our house and see Hilda inside. Hilda, the oldest of the children, whose radiant beauty drew all the matchmakers of the region. I see the people who came through that door day and night to consult with my father who now, bent under the weight of his pack, knows not to whom he might turn for advice. And my mother, always gracious and brave, afraid to look at us, afraid to see the house, afraid to burst into tears, only to find she can never stop. So she looks at the sky, the pitiless sky that numbs us with an unseasonable and stifling heat. And the sun, will it keep its secret? The night before, very late, like makeshift gravediggers, we had dug a dozen holes under the trees to bury what remained of our jewelry, precious objects, and money. I buried the gold watch I had been given as a bar mitzvah present. For years I dreamed of returning to my native town. It was an obsession. It took 2 decades, and that trip has now been added to my obsessions. It was night. There was a sleeping town and a sleeping house which hadn't changed. The same gate, same garden, same well. Choked with fear, as though caught in a whirlwind of hallucinations, I wondered whether it had all been a dream, whether our Jewish neighbors were still there, and my parents, and my sisters too. Terror swept me away and carried me back. I waited for a window to open, and for a boy who looked like the child I had been to call out to me, "Hey, mister, what are you doing in my dream?" But strangers were living in my house. They had never heard my name. Inside, nothing had changed. The same furniture, the same tile stove my father had borrowed money to buy, the beds, tables, and chairs were ours, still in the same places. My feverish eyes wandered left and right, up and down. Was it possible that not a single trace of us remained? But there was one, just one. On the wall above my bed had been a photograph of my beloved master, Rebbe Israel of Wisnitz. I remember it well. I had hung it there the day he died, the 2nd day of the month of Sivan. I can see myself standing there, a heavy hammer in my hand, driving in the nail and hanging the frame. As I write these words, I suddenly realize that my mother died 8 years later on exactly the same day, along with my little sister and Grandma Nissel. I cried for the Rebbe's death as I hung his photograph above my bed. The nail was still there. A huge cross was hanging from it. "We must go now," my mother said. "We must stay together." It was Tuesday afternoon. We were still in Siget. Our convoy would not leave for several days. We had been temporarily transferred to the smaller ghetto, whose inhabitants had just been driven out. We moved into the home of Mendel, my father's brother. My mother cooked our favorite dish, latkes, potato pancakes. This time there was no rationing. We ate all we wanted. Mendel was my silent uncle. He had married Golda, daughter of my maternal uncle Israel. He was pious and shy. They had 3 children. Their photograph lies before me, saved by a relative. Sacred books were scattered on the floor. Someone must have removed them from his bag at the last minute. The table was set and there was food on the plates. They had been taken away in the middle of a meal. This was what remained of a family. After the war, I questioned every survivor of the second transport I could find, seeking news of Uncle Mendel and his family. I thought I found the answer in 1988, when an elderly man called out to me in the lobby of a Miami Beach hotel. He was like me, of Romanian-Hungarian origin, from a small village near Siget, and he told me that he had stayed in the smaller ghetto until its evacuation. In fact, he had been in the same camp with my uncle. "Really?" I exclaimed. "You knew my uncle?" "Knew him," he said. "For years I've seen him, even in my sleep." And then he told me. At first Mendel and his son had been spared, like my father and me. and had been sent to a camp where conditions were relatively tolerable. But they were in different barracks and saw each other only during the day at work. One night, they could not bear to be separated. When the roll was called, the SS Blockführer counted and recounted the prisoners and ordered, "Let the prisoner who does not belong in this barracks show himself." Mendel's son took a few steps forward. "Closer!" the officer shouted. My young cousin obeyed, halting when he reached the SS man. The officer slowly drew his revolver and shot my cousin in the head point blank. My uncle, that sweet and timid man, hurled himself onto his son's body as if to protect him in death. The SS man stared at him for a long moment, then shot him in the head too. "Ever since then," my witness said, "I see Mendel and his son in my dreams. And I think of the biblical law that, out of compassion for animals, forbids the slaughter of an ox and his calf on the same day. The Germans, however, did not shrink from killing a father and son together without a second thought, as one would step on two insects." Fischel and Wojci, my cousins from Antwerp, later gave me a different version of their deaths. What is certain, though, is that the enemy annihilated my Uncle Mendel's family. And what happened to my Aunt Zlati, my father's younger sister? I search my memories of the ghetto for her, but she is not there. She was married to Naaman Eli. I don't remember their two very young children, nor do I recall their presence during the weeks before the transport. Naaman Eli, it seems, was among those the Hungarian army released from the labor battalions to be locked up in the ghetto. It seems he was deported with the first transport, and later succumbed to the pressures and temptations of the camp life, and became a cruel and murderous capo. It seems he was tried, sentenced to death, and executed by former deportees. My uncle in the enemy's service. A capo? My uncle a torturer of his brothers in misfortune? I don't want to believe it. But yes, that's the way it was. We arrived at the station where the cattle cars were waiting. Ever since my book Night, I have pursued those nocturnal trains that cross the devastated continent. Their shadow haunts my writing. They symbolize solitude, distress, and the relentless march of Jewish multitudes toward agony and death. I freeze every time I hear a train whistle. Why were those trains allowed to roll unhindered into Poland? Why were the tracks leading to Birkenau never bombed? I have put these questions to American presidents and generals and to high-ranking Soviet officers. Since Moscow and Washington knew what the killers were doing in the death camps, why was nothing done at least to slow down their production? That not a single Allied military aircraft ever tried to destroy the rail lines converging on Auschwitz remains an outrageous enigma to me. Birkenau was processing 10,000 Jews a day. Stopping a single convoy for a single night, or even for just a few hours, would have prolonged so many lives. At the least, it would have been a warning to the Germans. Jewish lives do matter. But the free world didn't care whether Jews lived or died, whether they were annihilated one day or the next. And so the sealed trains continued to shatter the silence of Europe's flowering landscapes. Meanwhile, our world contracted steadily. The country became a city, the city a street, the street a house, the house a room, the room a sealed cattle car, the cattle car a concrete cellar where... No, let us go no further. Decency and custom forbid it. I said it earlier when speaking of my grandfather. In Jewish tradition, a man's death belongs to him alone. Let the gas chambers remain closed to prying eyes and to the imagination. We will never know all that happened behind those doors of steel. They say the victims fought among themselves for a breath of air. for one more second of life, that they climbed on the shoulders of the weakest in the so-called Todeskampf, the final struggle among the dying. Much has been said when silence ought to have prevailed. Let the dead speak for themselves if they so choose. If not, may they be left in peace. It is unbelievable how fast people adapt. It hurts to admit it, but within hours of first breathing the cattle car's nauseating air, we began to feel at home. Home was the edge of the wooden plank I sat on as I dreamed of the Jewish exiles of antiquity and the Middle Ages. More curious than afraid, I thought of myself as their brother. Mixed into my sadness, there was undeniable excitement, for we were living a historic event, a historic adventure. The main thing was that we were still together. Had we been told that this journey would last for weeks or even years, we would have replied, "May God grant that it be so." For nothing is worse than the unknown, and that was our destination, the unknown. I remember clinging to the thought that nothing is unknown to God, while nothing is truly known to man. A rumor spread through the train. The Jewish doctors and their families, until recently allowed to live outside the ghetto, had been ordered to return to the ghetto the night before the transport and to join us that morning at the station. But we had seen no sign of them. It was now said that they had gathered at one of their homes the night before and decided to kill themselves. The rumor was apparently false, for in Birkenau I ran into our family doctor, Dr. Fish, who had helped deliver Sepuka. But 30 years later, I found that the story was true after all. I was lecturing at a large university near Boston when a member of the physics department came up to me. "You're from Siget, aren't you?" he asked. "So am I." He introduced himself, and the name gave me a start. He was the son of a famous surgeon. In Siget, we had evolved in different circles, but we had been brought to Auschwitz in the same convoy. We had a long talk about our town, and at one point I asked him about the rumor. He confirmed it. The doctors had indeed agreed on a collective suicide pact. But why, since at the time we didn't know where they were taking us? It turned out that his father did know. He had operated on a German officer who told him everything. Afterward, he had summoned his colleagues to discuss what to do. The majority voted not to board the trains, deciding they might as well die at home. Some of the suicides did not succeed. They were carried to the cattle cars on stretchers. My new friend, the physics professor, died one night in June 1991. A suicide, rumor had it. I was struck by the date. I realized that he too had died on the second day of the month of Sivan, exactly 47 years after his missed appointment with death in Birkenau. Life in the cattle cars was the death of my adolescence. How quickly I aged. As a child, I loved the unexpected. A visitor from afar, an unforeseen event, a marriage, a storm, even a disaster. Anything was preferable to routine. Now, it was just the opposite. Anything was preferable to change. We clung to the present. We dreaded the future. Hunger, thirst, and heat, the fetid stench, the hysterical howling of a woman gone mad, we were ready to endure it all, to suffer it all. So much so that a normal, structured social life soon took shape in the car. Families stayed together, sharing whatever came their way. Hard-boiled eggs, dried cakes, or fruit, respecting strict rules about drinking water, allowing each member a turn near the barred openings or at the waste pail shielded by blankets. People adjusted with disconcerting rapidity. Morning and evening we said our prayers together. I had brought some precious books along in my pack, a commentary by Rabbi Haim David Azulai, the Haida, the Kedushat Levy of the Berdichever Rebbe. I opened them and tried hard to concentrate. A phrase of the Zohar, a major work of the Kabbalah, haunted me. When the people of Israel set out into exile, God went with them. And now, I wondered, how far would God follow us now? On the last day, when the train stopped near the Auschwitz station, our premonitions resurfaced. A few neighbors devoured more than their rations, as though sensing that their days were numbered. My mother kept entreating us, stay together at all costs. Someone, I can't remember who, asked, "What if we can't? What if they separate us?" My mother's answer, "Then we'll meet again at home as soon as the war is over." Certain images of the days and nights spent on that train invade my dreams even now. Anticipation of danger, fear of the dark, the screams of poor Mrs. Schechter, who, in her delirium, saw flames in the distance. The efforts to make her stop, the terror in her little boy's eyes. I recall every hour, every second. How could I forget? They were the last hours I spent with my family. The murmured prayers of my grandmother, whose eyes saw beyond this world. My mother's gestures, which had never been more tender. The troubled face of my little sister, who refused to show her fear. Yes, my memory gathered it all in, retained it all. There was sudden trepidation that gripped us when, toward midnight, the train lurched forward again after stopping for several hours. I can still hear the whistle. Elsewhere, I have told of what happened next, or rather I have tried to tell it. But it feels like yesterday. It feels like now. Through the cracks in the boards, I see barbed wire stretching to infinity. A thought occurs to me. The Kabbalah is right. Infinity exists. I see myself sitting there haggard and disoriented, a shadow among shadows. I hear my little sister's fitful breathing. I try to conjure up my mother's features and my father's. I need someone to reassure me. My heart thunders in deafening beats. Then there is silence, heavy and complete. Something was about to happen. We could feel it. Fate would at last reveal a truth reserved exclusively for us, a primordial truth, an ultimate postulate that would annihilate or overshadow all received ideas. There was a burst of noise, and the night was shattered into 1,000 pieces. I felt myself shaken, pulled to my feet, pushed toward the door, toward strange shouting beings and barking dogs, a swelling throng that would cover the earth. In night, I tell of the wrath of the veterans. They swore at us. "What the hell are you Schweinhunde doing here?" I was puzzled. Did they think we had come to this hell voluntarily, out of curiosity? Only years later did I understand. Two of their former companions, Rudolf Erbe and Alfred Wetzler, had managed to escape from Birkenau in 1944 to warn Hungarian Jews of what was awaiting them. That's why they were so enraged. They thought we should have known. Some of them even hit us. Where were we going? It mattered little, for it was the same everywhere. All roads led to the enemy. It was he who would throw open the invisible black door that awaited us. "Stay together," my mother said. For another minute we did, clinging to one another's arms. Nothing in the world could separate us. The entire German army could not take my little sister from me. Then a curt order was issued. Men on one side, women on the other. And that was that. A single order, and we were separated. I stared intently, trying desperately not to lose sight of my mother, my little sister with her hair of gold and sun, my grandmother, my older sisters. I see them always, for I am still looking for them, trying to embrace them one last time. We were taken away before I could tell my mother goodbye, before I could kiss her hand and beg her forgiveness for the wrongs I must have done her, before I could squeeze Sipika, my little sister, to my heart. What remains of that night, like no other, is an irremediable sense of loss, of parting. My mother and my little sister left, and I never said goodbye. It all remains unreal. It's only a dream, I told myself as I walked, hanging on my father's arm. It's a nightmare that they have torn me from those I love, that they are beating people to death, that Birkenau exists, and that it harbors a gigantic altar where demons of fire devour our people. It's in God's nightmare that human beings are hurling living Jewish children into the flames. I reread what I have just written, and my hand trembles. I who barely weep am in tears. I see the flames again, and the children, and yet again I tell myself that it is not enough to weep. It took me a long time to convince myself I was not somehow mistaken. I have checked with others who arrived that same night, consulted documents of the Sonderkommandos, and yes, 1,000 times yes, unable to handle such a large number of Hungarian Jews in the crematoria. The killers were not content merely to incinerate children's dead bodies. In their barbarous madness, they cast living Jewish children into specially tended furnaces. And if I bear within me a nameless grief and disillusionment, a bottomless despair, it is because that night I saw good and thoughtful Jewish children, bearers of mute words and dreams, walking into darkness before being consumed by the flames. I see them now, and I still curse the killers, their accomplices, the indifferent spectators who knew and kept silent. And creation itself, creation, and those who perverted and distorted it. I feel like screaming, howling like a madman, so that world, the world of the murderers, might know it will never be forgiven. To this day, I am shaken when I see a child, for behind him I glimpse other children. Starving, terrified, drained, they march without a backward glance toward truth and death, which are perhaps the same. Uncomplaining, unprotesting, asking no one's pity, it is as if they have had enough of living on a planet so cruel, so vile, and so filled with hate that their very innocence has brought their death. Do not deny it. I forbid you to deny it. Know, then, that the world that let the killers annihilate 1.5 million Jewish children bears its guilt within itself. That night, someone within me, my other self, told me it was impossible that these atrocities could be committed in the middle of the 20th century, while the world stayed silent. This was not the Middle Ages. My very last resistance broken, I let myself be pulled, pushed, and kicked like a deaf and mute sleepwalker. I could see everything, grasp it, and register it, but only later would I try to put in order all the sensations and all the memories. How stunned I was, for example, to discover another time, outside time, a universe parallel to this one, a creation within creation, with its own laws, customs, structures, and language. In this universe, some men existed only to kill, and others only to die. And the system functioned with exemplary efficiency. Tormentors tormented and crushed their prey. Torturers tortured human beings whom they met for the first time. Slaughterers slaughtered their victims without so much as a glance. Flames rose to heaven, and nothing ever jammed the mechanism. It was as if all unfolded according to a plan decreed from the beginning of time. And what of human ideals, or of the beauty of innocence, or the weight of justice? And what of God in all that? I didn't understand, though I wanted to. Ask any survivor and you will hear the same thing. Above all, we tried to understand. Why all these deaths? What was the point of this death factory? How to account for the demented mind that devised this black hole of history called Birkenau? Perhaps there was nothing to understand.